The world outside is white, a blinding, silent, suffocating white. Snowdrifts pile against the rough-hewn log walls, sometimes reaching the eaves, burying the small cabin in a frozen embrace. The wind, a relentless predator, screams through the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains, carrying ice crystals that sting any exposed flesh. This is winter in the high country, 1800 style. Not a picturesque postcard, but a brutal test of endurance. Inside, the air is thick with wood smoke. A small fire crackles in the stone hearth, the only source of warmth against temperatures that plummet far below freezing, sometimes for weeks on end. This tiny log box, perhaps no bigger than a modern bedroom, is the sole refuge against a world determined to freeze, starve, and crush the life out of anything that dares to remain. This isn't a temporary camping trip. This is months of isolation, months of battling gnawing hunger, bone-chilling cold, and the crushing weight of solitude. What did it truly take for a mountain man, a trapper, alone, or perhaps with a single partner, to survive a frozen winter locked away in an 1800s Rocky Mountain cabin? It took more than just a sturdy shelter, more than just skill with a rifle. It took foresight, relentless labor, iron will, and an intimate understanding of the deadly beauty surrounding him. It was a gamble against nature at its most unforgiving. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Tonight, we step inside that snowbound cabin. We feel the bite of the frost, the pangs of hunger, the long, dark hours. We explore the preparations, the daily struggles, the ingenious tricks, and the sheer grit required to emerge alive when the spring thaw finally breaks winter's grip. This is the story of spending a frozen winter in the heart of the wild. Part 1. The Race Against the Freeze, Autumn Preparations. The first hint of gold on the aspen leaves wasn't just a sign of beauty. It was a starting gun. For the mountain man intending to winter over, autumn was a frantic race against time, a period of intense labor to stockpile the resources needed to survive the coming siege of cold and snow. First and foremost, firewood. Not just a few logs, but a mountain of it. The small cabin fireplace or stove would burn day and night for months. Calculating the sheer volume needed was critical. Underestimating meant freezing. Overestimating meant wasted effort, but that was the safer bet. Axe work became a daily, grueling rhythm. Felling dead, standing timber, drier and less likely to smoke, chopping it into manageable lengths, hauling it back to the cabin, and stacking it high, preferably under some sort of lean-to or covering to keep off the worst of the snow. This wasn't just about warmth, it was about cooking, melting snow for water, and keeping the crushing darkness and predators at bay. The quality of the axe and the skill in using it, something we explored in our tools episode, were paramount. Next, securing the shelter. The cabin itself, perhaps built the previous summer using techniques like those we detailed in Mastering the Wilderness, needed to be made as winter-proof as possible. Chinking the gaps between the logs with mud, moss, or clay was crucial to block the drafts that could steal precious heat. Any cracks or holes in the roof, often made of sod, bark, or rough shingles, needed patching. The door and any window openings, often covered with scraped animal hide, oiled paper, or if lucky a precious pane of glass, had to be sealed tightly. Sometimes snow itself would be piled against the lower walls to provide extra insulation. Food stores were life. As Osborne Russell noted in his journal, among mountaineers, it is better to count ribs than tracks, meaning it was far wiser to have food secured and stored than to rely solely on the uncertainty of the winter hunt. While some hunting and trapping might be possible in winter, it was unreliable and dangerous. The bulk of the winter's food had to be gathered and preserved beforehand. Meat from autumn hunts, deer, elk, buffalo, would be smoked, dried into jerky, or sometimes frozen if temperatures dropped early and stayed low. Fish caught in abundance might also be smoked or dried. Berries, roots, and edible plants gathered in late summer and fall would be dried or stored carefully. Caches of food might even be hidden away from the main cabin, safe from animals and potential theft, their locations carefully memorized. Clothing and gear needed inspection and repair. Moccasins needed patching or replacing. Wool blankets and clothing had to be checked for holes. Snowshoes, essential for travel over deep drifts, needed to be crafted or repaired, their frames sturdy, their webbing tight. Traps for beaver or smaller game had to be cleaned, mended, and ready. Ammunition supplies, lead, powder, flints, or caps were checked and carefully stored to keep them dry. This wasn't just preparation, it was a ritual of survival, a physical and mental hardening against the inevitable. Every swing of the axe, every patch on the roof, every strip of jerky hung to dry was an investment against the frozen months ahead. Failure in autumn meant almost certain death in winter. Part 2, the long confinement, daily life inside the walls. As winter tightened its grip, the world outside the cabin often became impassable, hostile. Deep snowdrifts, sub-zero temperatures, and howling blizzards forced the mountain man indoors for days, sometimes weeks, at a time. Life shrunk to the confines of those 4 log walls, a monotonous cycle dictated by the relentless demands of survival. The hearth became the absolute center of existence. Keeping the fire alive was the primary, non-negotiable task. Letting it die out wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Wood had to be fed constantly, but judiciously, to conserve the precious stockpile. Banking the embers carefully at night, hoping to coax them back to life in the frigid dawn, was a daily ritual. The fire provided not just warmth, but light in the long hours of darkness, a means to cook meager meals, and crucially, a way to melt snow or ice for drinking water, a laborious process often done in a kettle hung over the flames. Conserving resources was paramount. Food stores gathered in autumn were rationed carefully. A typical meal might be boiled or roasted jerky, perhaps supplemented with a handful of dried berries or roots, or if lucky, some hoarded flour baked into a crude bannock or flapjack. Every scrap was valuable. Water obtained by melting snow was used sparingly. Ammunition, tools, clothing, everything was treated with care, as replacement was impossible. Cabin fever was a real and dangerous threat. The crushing monotony, the lack of sunlight, the constant confinement in a small, smoky space could wear down even the strongest mind. Maintaining a routine, however simple, was crucial. Tasks filled the hours, repairing gear, mending tiers and buckskins, rewebbing snowshoes, sharpening knives and axes, perhaps crafting small items, carving a new spoon, making lead balls using a molten ladle over the fire, preparing hides from any animals trapped nearby. Reading, if the man was literate and possessed a rare book or Bible, offered a mental escape. Journaling, as practiced by men like Osborne Russell, provided an outlet and a record. Hygiene was basic and challenging. Washing was infrequent and done quickly with snowmelt water heated over the fire. The cabin air, thick with wood smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies and curing hides, could become stifling. Venting the smoke without losing too much precious heat was a constant balancing act, often managed by a poorly sealed chimney or simply cracking the door slightly. Listening to the wind howl, watching the snow pile higher, checking the dwindling wood pile. These were the markers of time. Days blurred into weeks. The silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the shriek of the wind, could be deafening. It was a test not just of physical endurance, but of mental fortitude, a battle waged within the smoky confines of the log walls against the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. Part 3. Venturing out, the hunt for food and fuel. Staying cooped up indefinitely wasn't an option. The woodpile, no matter how large, eventually dwindled. Stored food ran low, and sometimes the simple need to check trap lines or scout for game forced the mountain man out into the frozen landscape. Venturing out, however, was fraught with peril. Timing was everything. Choosing the right moment was critical. Stepping out during a blizzard or a period of extreme, life-threatening cold was suicide. Waiting for a lull in the storm, perhaps a day when the sun offered a fleeting illusion of warmth, was essential. Even then, preparations were meticulous. Dressing for the cold was an art form, layering wool, buckskin, and fur, as we discussed in our episode on frontier clothing. Protecting extremities, hands, feet, ears, nose, was paramount to prevent frostbite, a constant and insidious threat. Mittens were generally warmer than gloves. Moccasins needed extra insulation, perhaps stuffed with rabbit fur or dry grass, and worn over multiple pairs of wool socks or wrappings. Snowshoes were the key to mobility. Without them, travel through deep snow was exhausting, slow, and often impossible. These wide, webbed frames distributed weight, allowing the wearer to stay atop the snowpack instead of sinking with every step. Crafting and maintaining snowshoes was a vital skill, the designs often borrowed or adapted from Native American patterns suited to the local snow conditions, long and narrow for open country, shorter and rounder for maneuvering in forests. Hunting and trapping in winter. Game was scarce and wary. Tracks were easily visible in the snow, but so were the hunters. Stealth was crucial. The sharp crack of a twig underfoot could echo for miles in the still, cold air. Animals like deer and elk often moved to lower elevations or sheltered valleys, requiring long, arduous treks to find. Small game, rabbits, squirrels, grouse, might be closer but offered less sustenance. Osborne Russell himself documented the harsh reality, writing of a time when we had to live chiefly upon roots for 10 days. Trapping, particularly for beaver under the ice or marten and fox along waterways, continued, but checking traps meant long, cold journeys and the risk of frozen fingers while handling icy chains and catches. Gathering more fuel. Even finding more firewood could be a challenge. Dead standing trees might be buried under deep snow. Cutting frozen wood was harder work. Hauling logs back through deep drifts, often on a small hand sled or simply dragged, was back-breaking labor that consumed precious calories and risked exposure. Navigating the white world. Landmarks could disappear under snow. Familiar trails vanished. Whiteout conditions could disorient even experienced woodsmen. Reading the subtle signs, the direction of the wind, the angle of the sun when visible, the shape of the drifts, the type of trees, was essential for finding one's way back to the life-saving shelter of the cabin. Getting lost in winter was often a death sentence. Every trip outside was a calculated risk, a gamble weighing the need for resources against the dangers of exposure, exhaustion, and disorientation. It required immense physical effort, sharp senses, and an unwavering focus on the single goal. Get what you need and get back to the fire before the cold claims you. Part 4, The Unseen Enemies, Cold, Sickness, and Injury. Beyond the visible challenges of snow and scarce food, the wintering mountain man faced insidious enemies that attacked from within and without, the relentless cold, debilitating sickness, and the ever-present specter of injury. The battle against cold. Even inside the cabin, the cold was a constant presence. The fire might warm the immediate vicinity, but corners remained frigid. Frost would creep across the inside walls, coating everything with a layer of ice. Sleeping meant burrowing under every available fur and blanket, often fully clothed, positioning oneself strategically to benefit from the hearth's radiant heat without getting scorched. Waking up in the pre-dawn chill required immense willpower. Frostbite, as mentioned, was a constant danger, not just outside, but even from brief exposure indoors if circulation was poor or clothing damp. Numb fingers, toes, ears, and noses were early warnings that could quickly escalate to tissue death and potential amputation. A death sentence when alone. Sickness in isolation. Winter weakened the body, making it susceptible to illness. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables, was a real threat during long winters reliant on dried meat. Symptoms included weakness, bleeding gums, and reopening of old wounds. While some Native American knowledge included sources of vitamin C like pine needle tea, not all frontiersmen knew or utilized these remedies. Respiratory infections, coughs, lung fever, pneumonia, thrived in the damp, smoky, close confines of the cabin and could easily become fatal without modern medicine. Simple digestive ailments could also become serious problems. We touched upon frontier medicine in another episode, but the resources available in a remote winter cabin were minimal, perhaps a few hoarded herbs or basic first aid knowledge, often insufficient for serious conditions. The amplified danger of injury. An accident that might be inconvenient in summer could be catastrophic in winter. A deep cut from an axe while chopping wood, difficult to keep clean and prone to infection. A broken bone from a fall on ice, impossible to set properly and leading to permanent disability or death. A severe burn from the fireplace. With no access to help, even minor injuries could become life-threatening. Infection was a constant fear. A simple task, performed carelessly due to fatigue or cold-numbed hands, could lead to disaster. The mountain man had to be hyper-vigilant, moving deliberately, maintaining his tools, and avoiding unnecessary risks, knowing that he was his own, and only, doctor. These unseen enemies, the penetrating cold, the opportunistic diseases, the potential for crippling injury, added another layer of tension to the winter confinement. Survival wasn't just about finding food and staying warm, it was about maintaining health and avoiding that single misstep that could tip the delicate balance towards tragedy. Part 5. The Weight of Silence, Isolation, and the Mind. Perhaps the most underestimated challenge of wintering over wasn't the cold or the hunger, but the profound, crushing isolation. For months on end, the mountain man might not see another human soul. The silence of the snow-covered world, broken only by the wind or the cry of a distant animal, could become a heavy burden on the human psyche. Cabin fever, that colloquial term for the irritability, restlessness, and depression brought on by prolonged confinement, was a genuine psychological battle. The sameness of the days, the lack of external stimulation, the constant proximity to the edge of survival. It could fray nerves and distort perception. Minor annoyances could fester into major grievances if sharing the cabin with a partner. Alone, the silence could become filled with imagined sounds, or the weight of one's own thoughts could become overwhelming. Maintaining morale. Finding ways to keep the mind occupied and spirits up was as crucial as keeping the fire lit. As mentioned, chores like mending gear, carving, or reading provided distraction. Some men might sing or talk to themselves simply to break the silence. Others found solace in observing the subtle changes in the winter landscape, the tracks of animals, the patterns of the frost, a deep connection to the natural world that sustained them. The role of ritual and routine. Establishing a daily rhythm, no matter how simple, provided structure and a sense of purpose. Waking, tending the fire, melting snow, preparing food, performing chores, checking the weather. These small rituals anchored the mind against the formless expanse of winter. Dreams and memories. In the long, dark hours, thoughts inevitably turned inward. Memories of home, family, past rendezvous, or future plans could offer comfort or fuel despair. Dreams could be vivid, offering escape or haunting reminders of the precariousness of life. The ability to manage one's own thoughts, to focus on the task at hand, and to maintain a sliver of hope for spring was a survival skill as vital as any physical one. The rare visitor. Occasionally, the monotony might be broken by the arrival of another trapper or a band of Native Americans navigating the winter landscape. Such encounters were often welcome breaks, opportunities to share news, trade goods, or simply enjoy human company for a brief time before solitude closed in once more. But visitors could also bring danger or deplete precious resources. The psychological toll of spending months locked in a frozen world, constantly battling the elements and one's own mind, cannot be overstated. It forged individuals of incredible resilience, but it also undoubtedly broke others, their stories lost to the silent snows. It was the ultimate test of inner strength against the vast emptiness of the winter wilderness. Part 6. The Thaw, Hope and New Dangers. After months that felt like an eternity, subtle shifts began to signal the end of winter's reign. The sunlight, though still weak, lingered a little longer each day. The relentless, bone-deep cold began to lose its sharpest edge, replaced by days hovering closer to the freezing point. Icicles hanging from the cabin eaves might drip, ever so slowly, during the warmest part of the day. These were the first whispers of the thaw, harbingers of hope, the promise of spring. For the mountain man who had endured the winter, these signs were intoxicating. They meant the end of confinement, the return of abundant game, the opening of rivers, and the possibility of travel towards the summer rendezvous or back to civilization. The psychological burden began to lift, replaced by anticipation and a renewed sense of purpose. Thoughts turned to trapping beaver as the ice broke up on the streams, planning routes, and the simple joy of feeling sun on the face without the immediate threat of frostbite. New dangers emerge. However, the thaw brought its own set of challenges. Melting snow could turn the landscape into a morass of mud and slush, making travel difficult and treacherous. Rivers, choked with melting ice and swollen with runoff, became raging torrents, dangerous to cross. Avalanches, triggered by warming temperatures, destabilizing the heavy snowpack accumulated over winter, became a sudden and deadly threat in mountainous terrain. Emerging wildlife. Animals also emerged from their winter dormancy or returned from lower elevations. While this meant potential food, it also meant increased encounters with predators like bears emerging hungry from their dens, or wolves emboldened by the lean winter months. The relative safety of the deep snow period, when many animals were less active or accessible, gave way to a more dynamic and potentially dangerous environment. Assessing the damage. Spring was also a time to take stock. How had the cabin weathered the winter? Were repairs needed? How much food and ammunition remained? Critically, how was the man's own health? Months of poor nutrition, cold, and inactivity could leave one weakened and vulnerable, even as the weather improved. The transition from the static survival of winter to the active demands of spring required a careful rebuilding of strength and resources. The first green shoots pushing through the melting snow, the sound of running water replacing the silence of ice, the return of migrating birds. These were powerful symbols of survival, of having stared into the frozen heart of the wilderness and emerged alive. The thaw wasn't just a change in weather, it was a resurrection, a hard-won victory against the longest odds, paving the way for the next cycle of life and travel in the vast untamed Rockies. Surviving a winter alone in a Rocky Mountain cabin during the 1800s, it wasn't an adventure, it was a siege. A relentless battle against the elements, against hunger, against sickness, and perhaps most profoundly, against the crushing weight of isolation. It demanded foresight, resilience, and an almost spiritual connection to the harsh rhythms of the wild. Those who emerged into the spring thaw were transformed, marked by an experience few today can truly comprehend. They had faced the frozen heart of the wilderness and endured. Their stories, etched in journal entries or passed down through generations, remind us of the incredible capacity of the human spirit to adapt and survive against overwhelming odds. What aspect of winter survival do you find most challenging or impressive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our other deep dives into frontier life, like how these cabins were built or the essential clothing that made survival possible. Thanks for joining us inside the frozen world of wild America. Until next time, stay resilient.